The Royal Palm Beach Jane Doe, identified as Patti Lisa Rust. On December 20th, 1987, in Royal Palm Beach, Florida, a woman was out walking her dog near the intersection of 130th Avenue and 72nd Road, which is described as being made of shell rock. The woman and her dog entered a stand of trees, and they found a woman who had likely been there for a while, possibly as long as 3 years. She was believed to be in her 20s to 30s. No clothing, jewelry, or personal effects found at all, and as a result, foul play is suspected. They began with a forensic sketch, although I've not been able to locate the sketch itself. Since then, 2 other recreations have been done, as you can see here. As time passed, all of the normal things were done. She was entered into NamUs, and they of course reached out to the public. In the end, the only option would be DNA, and this one was again done by Othram Labs. And Patti Rust once again has her name. Patti was last known to live in the area of Lauderdale by the Sea, which is a suburb of Fort Lauderdale. She was last known to be there in the late 1980s. The lack of information on this case is disheartening, and they really need someone to come forward. Patti grew up with 2 brothers, Stephen and Anthony, and she would marry Kenneth Allen Rust on November 11th, 1984, at the age of 24. And this was 2 years before she went missing in 1986. That would mean she had likely been there shorter than they thought, maybe about a year or a little more. Patti's parents passed in 2003 and 2007 without ever knowing what happened to Patti. Hopefully the news came in time for Patti's 2 brothers. Patti Rust went unidentified for 36 years, and she was found 44 miles or 70 kilometers from home. Had she lived, she would be 62 years old today. The Applegate Jane Doe, identified as Patricia Rose. This story begins in Applegate, California, January 6, 1985. It was here that 2 local men were out hunting off of Bull Road, and they had with them dogs that would suddenly run off. The men would follow to investigate what was going on, and they found a skeleton in dense brush. The Placer County Sheriff's Office would locate only 2 scraps of clothing, one of which was rust-colored polyester that could be from pants, as well as second rust-colored fragments that were likely from a knit sweater. They did the best they could, but no COD could ever be determined. According to the anthropologists, they belonged to a female who was likely not yet of legal age. Familial DNA for CODIS was obtained in 2005, but no matches were made. That would change once DNA was processed for genetic genealogy and uploaded into public databases. They were able to narrow it down to the point that they would approach a sibling of Patricia Rose, requesting a DNA sample that would eventually confirm what they all suspected. The missing woman, known to family and friends as Tori or Patti, had finally been found. Patti went missing from Sacramento in 1980. She was married to John Bowden at the time, but the 2 were estranged. Patricia was a 20-year-old mother with a toddler who would be found alone in the hotel room where they were staying. She never returned to the room, and she was never heard from again. So they need someone who was close to her at the time to come forward. The number is on the screen. Patricia Rose went unidentified for 39 years. Had she lived, she would be 63 years old today. Mary Jane Doe, identified as Tabetha Murlin. The story began on May 15, 1992, in Fort Wayne, Indiana. In this case, a contractor was working on a building and had entered a basement that had become flooded. It was here he discovered a woman wrapped in what was described as a furniture blanket. They believed she'd been there no longer than a year. The building had also retained water in the area she was recovered from, which seems to imply standing water, which doesn't, of course, help with the DNA later on. It doesn't appear that anyone had harmed her, and it was this in part that made them believe she was homeless and likely succumbed to the elements. She had wrapped herself up to stay warm. She was 26 weeks pregnant at the time it happened. In 2017, they decided to take another look at her case in hopes of identifying her. They started with digital dental x-rays as well as DNA for CODIS. Unfortunately, these two things, while more economical, didn't end in a match. But they didn't stop. They would eventually match her to her late mother and her living father, as well as 2 aunts. This would lead to Tabetha Murlin, who was just 23 when she passed. She had married and fallen out of contact with her family. Then she separated from her husband, and it appears she found herself without a home. They were also able to find her estranged husband at the time, and he's been interviewed, although they don't identify if he's the father of her child. We do know that Tabetha disappeared earlier in the year from Fort Wayne, Indiana, which is the same town she was eventually found in May of 1992. Tabetha Ann Murlin went unidentified for 31 years. Had she lived, she would be 54 years old today. The Fillmore Jane Doe, identified as Linda Burka, also known as Linda Laverne Orndorff Charlesworth Burka. This case begins near Fillmore, California, on January 7, 2000. It was on this day that a geologist was surveying near Grimes County Road when he found what was described as partially buried skeletal remains. She was wearing Cherokee brand jeans and a button-down shirt. She had on distinctive knee-high socks that had a diamond pattern. Additionally, they would find a dark green backpack nearby. They did not believe she had passed where she was found, but rather she'd been brought there from somewhere else. They did the less complex DNA testing that was normal for the time, and they would enter her into CODIS, but it led nowhere. Same with her name as profile. They would eventually do more DNA testing and genetic genealogy. Othram Labs would become involved, and their forensic genealogist would identify our Jane Doe. Linda Burka was born in 1947 and would have been 52 on the date she was found. Linda was born in Alexandria, Virginia, on September 25, 1947. She was married and widowed at a young age. But then when she was 27, she would marry again, this time to a man named Edward Burka, who at 41 was 14 years older than his new bride. They would remain married for 15 years, divorcing in 1990, under allegations of cruelty and constructive desertion. At some point along the way, she moved to Long Beach, California, which is the last place she was known to live. Her mother would live 1 more year beyond the year Linda was reported missing. We know she was found in 2000 and divorced in 1990, but they need more information on where she was for that 10 years in between. She was found about an hour and a 20-minute drive away from home. Long Beach is 80 miles or 128 kilometers away from where she was found. Linda Laverne Orndorff Charlesworth Burka went unidentified for 24 years. Had she lived, she would be 77 years old today. Thank you everyone so much for watching and listening. If you aren't subscribed, please take a moment to do so, hitting the bell so you are notified of new videos. And thank you all for leaving comments and emojis to help with engagement. It all pushes the channel to get suggested to new people, and I appreciate that so much. Take care of yourselves and each other.